Welcome to Hyperspace Prospector. I will be discussing Reign of the Empire, The Mask of Fear by Alexander Freed. I almost didn't read this. With everything going on right now and fascism trying to take over, I was like, the last thing I need is a fictional fascist empire, right? But then I thought, actually, there might be some good tips in here. And Mon Mothma always has good wisdom, so I was like, you know what? I'm going to do it. I'm going to read this book. And it was the right choice. There were parts that were very depressing. I did have to stop reading a couple times, but there were also moments of just clarity and hope that made it worthwhile. I've also seen a couple people asking, what was Mon Mothma up to during the Clone Wars? Because unfortunately, they cut a lot of the scenes out of Revenge of the Sith that explain that. Unfortunately, it does go into some detail in this book. Obviously, we get references to the delegation of the 2000 many times, but there's also an entire anecdote about the opening salvos of the Clone Wars. Apparently, she was on Chandrilla at the time, and out of nowhere, the Separatists just, boom, showed up and started orbital bombing the place. Absolutely terrifying. Somewhat like Naboo, they didn't have like a standing military or navy fleet. And so all they could do was turn on the planetary defense shields, and the cities kind of had these domes over them, and then just pray they held. At first, the population was terrified. Mon Mothma was quickly brought down into a bunker, but that's where it gets interesting, because after a few hours they realized the shields were holding. The Separatists continued dropping these firebombs on them, and the population came out into the streets and started pretending it was a fireworks show. They went outside and were like, ooh, just to like, you know how you get so nervous that you just have to let it out somehow and you get a little bit silly? I know that sounds strange, but if you've ever felt it, you know what I mean? And that's kind of what happened, which is really interesting. And it really ties into Andor and her scene at the wedding where she was so overwhelmed by everything going on, the blackmail, the assassination plots, and she loses it and she just dances. The feeling that you get sometimes in this book of things are so bad that the only thing you can do is basically laugh. It's so relatable with the news cycle right now. Like sometimes I get up and I read the latest horrifying facts that are happening. And at a certain point, there's only so much horror you can like absorb as a person. And it becomes funny. Like it's hard to explain. Anyway, they get it. They get like being bombarded with so much evil that you're just like, I can't take this anymore. Anyway, there's also other plots going on. We have Bail Organa, who has decided to play Lara Croft. So that was a really fun storyline of him running around the galaxy on these like archaeological and historical adventures, basically being Dr. Aphra or whatever. And it was a somewhat lighthearted, at first anyway, storyline. Then we get a really sinister one going on with Saw Gerrera. I don't want to spoil things, but it gets intense. I mean, it's Saw, what do you expect? But what's interesting is at the end, all these stories come together really well. They mesh. So even though it feels like you have Lara Croft over here, Bail Organa, and Mon Mothma with this hard-hitting political drama, and then Saw Gerrera with his mayhem, you know, what possible connection could there be? There is. You just gotta wait for it. I'm willing to wait for it. And I'm willing to wait for it. I will admit, I was so enthralled by Mon Mothma's story here. I did skip the other chapters in my first read, so I read this book just the Mon parts. And then I went back to the beginning and read the full book every chapter. It's okay if you do this. I'm giving you permission. If you like a particular character's POV in a novel, you don't have to read the whole book the first time. You can just read their point of view and then go back and read the other parts. It worked fine. It gave a ton of insight into Mon's character, especially what she went through right after the Empire basically was founded, when the Emperor gave his famous speech.
What's happened?
The Chancellor's been elaborating on a plot by the Jedi to overthrow the Senate.
The remaining Jedi will be hunted down and defeated.
So if you're wondering what's the timeline setting of this book, I would say it's kind of similar to the final season of Bad Batch. So a couple years after the Empire, but we still have clones. They're talking a little bit about the program to replace them. So similar to what we saw Hunter and Crosshair going through. But it's over in the Senate, so you get a lot more of the Senate stuff. We got some of that with Chuchi, obviously. I love Chuchi. She's not in this. That's the only complaint I have. Where is Senator Chuchi? The rest is great. Very minor quibble there. And it's only because I have a crush on her, so I'll admit that. And there's thousands of senators. I'm sure she's among them somewhere. It really explains, as I said, though, so much about what we saw in Andor. I would say this is a must-read if you enjoy that show. I did bookmark a few quotes, so I'm going to just go take a look at those. This is from Saw's group, specifically Sojin. The work was slow and tedious, and moving equipment back to the ship would be slower and more tedious yet. But revolutions were rarely glorious things. They were grueling, painful, and best handled with extreme deliberation. Something that's easy to forget if you just watch the Star Wars movies. You know, you get the cool blaster fights and running around. But in the novels, they do things like point this out, where it's like, no, actually it's kind of boring most of the time. You have to just keep going, day after day after day, dealing with fascism, not giving up, and that is hard work. Here's just a kind of frightening thought. So Mon Mothma has been pulled in for questioning, and she's been kind of left to rot in a room for hours, so she's had plenty of time to think. She wondered how far her interrogators were authorized to go and what they really sought. They had probably served in Republic intelligence or the other services during the war. She'd trusted in them then. She hadn't been naive or averse to oversight, but she'd trusted them. But somehow everything seemed more fragile now. Where would the system hold? And where would it break? So she's pointing out a lot of the same people were still there, but this time serving the Empire. It's really easy to be like, oh yeah, the Republic's great, blah, blah, blah. But it's like, nah, a lot of the people in government are the same people. Yeah, they're either not doing anything or they're just collaborating. And it's like, we used to trust them, but now they're serving the Empire. Was I wrong, or what? Are they still what's going on? And I really feel this. How fragile is everything? When will people say, no, this is enough? People you used to trust. I think there's a line in Andor, you know, people fail you. People fail. But how do you know when? How do you know how far they'll go? It's a mess. It's a mess. Fascism is a mess. All right. This time there are protests, but it's protests against the separatists rejoining the Empire. Well, it used to be the Republic, but you know, now it's the Empire. And the Imperials have basically arranged and deliberately tried to get public sentiment against the separatists just enough to make them feel nervous. So they wanted people to protest in this case to make the separatists remember that they are only there as long as the imperial government likes them. So they better toe the line, in other words. Mon's trying to get through the protesters. Some of them try to kill her. It's a whole thing. And this is her response that she's thinking about. Her mind, her intellect, knew only outrage and fury at the people who would treat her, treat anyone, as unworthy of dignity, as something less than enemies, because enemies could be respected. Enemies could be recognized for their virtues, for their valor, ideals, or skill, even when their causes were unjust. To treat people as obstacles whose removal was a source of pleasure was abominable. It was the antithesis of everything Mon had ever believed in. Part of her wanted to weep. Mostly, she wanted to scream. She's also recognizing towards the end of this book that she's privileged. You know, she's wealthy, she's powerful, she's gorgeous. I mean, it doesn't say that, but I'm just pointing that out. Not everyone has that. The reason so many people basically accepted the Empire was because they were barely scraping by, they were barely surviving. And someone coming in and telling them, hey, we're here to help, they'll just accept it. Who cares? A bunch of, well, quite frankly, oligarchs saying otherwise. So by the end of the book, Mon is starting to realize this and doing some self-reflection. So this is where we come into this quote. Did they care whether their emperor was a figurehead or a tyrant? Maybe everything she'd been working for meant nothing to them. And rightly so. When basic necessities were denied, then again, maybe a person could care about the galaxy as well as their next meal. And maybe she thought, you should treat them like people and ask them. Maybe you should stop making assumptions. That's who we need to aspire to be. It's not just someone who is trying to survive, which is so important, but also trying to survive while thinking of other people, while thinking of the galaxy. Or in our case, we just have to worry about one planet. It's possible to care about both. Here's another section about that same thing where the Grand Vizier has basically taken Mon aside and said, look, either stop going against the Emperor or we will take steps. Would you really start a war, Mon Mothma? You, the outspoken pacifist, knowing the cost would inevitably fall on the wretched, the exhausted creatures still limping from the separatist conflict. Would you go to war against the Emperor? Because if not, there is no threat you can make that we cannot counter with overwhelming force. So he's basically saying, Mon, you can't do anything to stop us. None of your little political machinations are going to do anything. So, are you either with us or are you actively fighting? Pick one. And in this moment, Mon is like, all right, yeah, I can see your point. I am not ready to start a war. And so she decides to go, okay, let's put our heads down for a bit, which leads us straight into Endor and straight into her speech where she finally decides not just to speak up about Gorman, but she decides, after all this, all right, Grand Vizier, I'm calling your bluff. If it's a war you want, a war you will get. And she goes out and she starts the rebellion. There had been rebel cells everywhere for many years, but she starts the rebellion, the coming together, everybody getting mostly on the same page. She starts the war. The actually serious, we're doing this war. The final few chapters of this book are crucial to the plot of Star Wars. Ironically, I think the Grand Vizier had something to do with that because he's really the one who shook Mon Mothma out of her kind of, I don't want to say delusion, but her idea that she can use political power to overthrow the Empire, that she can fix things from within, that she can use democracy and wrest power back to the representatives of the people and away from the dictator. And she realizes by the end of this book, no, you can't. Once fascism has truly taken root, the only thing you can do is dig it up from the roots. You can't just prune off a few branches here and there and hope something happens. I think a really great thing that you can do, read this, watch Endor, watch season 3 of Rebels, and then straight into Rogue One, A New Hope. Beautiful storyline right there. And if you were on the fence of whether or not it's worth getting this book, like a whole book about being a senator under the Empire, that sounds kind of boring. Trust me, it is not boring. It's so not. Oh, if anything, it's a little bit traumatizing. And as we all know, what are rebellions built on?
Rebellions are built on hope.